Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade has pushed back against Russian forces in the Serbyansk area. Just why is Ukraine launching strikes against Russia now? And how does Ukraine's tactics differ from Russia's meat grinder? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about that, plus the administration backtracking even harder about their totally imminent ceasefire. Let's get into it. Okay. Also, do me a favor, guys, hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it really, really helps me out. It tells YouTube that I am making quality content if you haven't already. Okay, so Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade. This is one of Ukraine's most reliable and highly trained brigades, operating a lot of the heavy equipment, particularly Western heavy equipment, actually retook the village of Nadaya in Luhansk Oblast. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, is that this is not a grand area in the larger scheme of things, right? This is really important to point out that the actual battle took place right here. And you can see that the total area recovered or liberated was probably something in the 2-kilometer range. So probably about 4 to 5 square kilometers. But the significance, of course, is that you could see along this river here, this is likely what the Ukrainians are trying to do is help to establish a little bit more of a defensive line and to force the Russians into this low ground. You can see this is literally swampy ground here. And as a general rule, swampland is terribly hard to defend because, well, water tends to flow downhill. So when the ground gets swampy and muddy, not only is it hard to pass through in its own right, but it also is generally in areas that are at low elevations. And especially in the era of drone warfare, sitting in the bottom of a bucket, so to speak, is literally shooting fish in a barrel. So the Ukrainians have an incentive to try to push the Russians back here. I think they also, again, really want to, I think their larger plan is probably to use this river here as kind of a natural barrier and to force the Russians to have only a few crossing points. And because remember, as we've seen in this era of drone warfare, your avenues of approach are really important, right? When you combine drones and mines, it means that you can canalize the enemy. And so Russians are, if they want to reinforce any of their positions near this Ryhodovka, they're going to have to come up through this one single roadway. And then pass through this one single roadway if they want to get to this contested region. And that is a shooting gallery for the Ukrainians. So they're likely trying to, again, really just try to improve kind of local conditions. I wouldn't characterize this as some kind of larger, more dramatic push from it's not really part of any larger dramatic offensive. But I think there may also be a little bit of an effort to apply pressure on the Russian flanks here from this kind of Russian advance that has taken it to the Oskil. But again, I'm sort of reluctant to say that because we just haven't seen this kind of broad maneuver efforts from the Ukrainians. They prefer pretty strongly to engage in these kind of nose-bloodying efforts. And this is sort of the deeper story I wanted to mention, is that we see a lot more Ukrainian offensive activity, but it seems like while Russia has learned to use its FPV drones and its meat wave assaults to incur high casualties but achieve highly effective results, particularly in targeting logistics and grinding on the Ukrainians with their meat wave, the Ukrainians seem to have found a more localized strategy in which they can engage in local suppression of enemy air assets, right, enemy drones, and then use these heavy mechanized forces to sort of conduct an isolate and assault process, right, a support by fire and an assault mission. Now, this cannot be done at scale, right? As we've seen, the Russians are quite good at deploying reserves and sort of shoring up their reserve capacity so that it can't turn into a larger breakthrough. But for seizing localized targets, the Ukrainians are actually quite good at it. And if you want some of the most interesting examples, those are actually, you'd have to look at the YouTube channel for the International Legion. They showcase some of their assault efforts really in pretty good detail. And those are actually available on combatvetnews.com. This is my sort of Patreon equivalent. And it's where you guys can support me, right? I'm entirely user supported. I don't get money from any kind of media outlet or any kind of government, other than the ads you see on YouTube. You guys watching ads, you guys donating on Combat Vet News is what supports me. And I drop every Tuesday and Thursday. I drop uncensored combat footage from the front lines, like this operation, actually. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade actually released video of the operation, and we're going to be breaking that down on Tuesday. So it's a no-brainer, right, to support me and get access to these deep dive videos that let us see the tactics on the ground. So the link is in the description, combatvetnews.com. Okay, so I wanted to make a couple of other points that I thought were pretty salient. One is that Russia has continued its policy of launching these drone strikes, and there's some dispute over whether they are targeting infrastructure. And we're already seeing the debate that we've, that's been going on at least this channel for a while, which is that the Russians say that they only agreed to a ceasefire against energy infrastructure, and the Ukrainians maintain that they have only agreed to a ceasefire with energy and infrastructure. And so while we haven't necessarily seen a drone, I haven't seen beyond a shadow of a doubt that things like a water treatment plant or a railway has been targeted, or like a rail station. I think the Ukrainians are like, hey man, like you're targeting Kiev, you're targeting some of our most dense areas, right? And like at some point you go, okay, is a road infrastructure, and when you have these kind of things, I think Ukraine sits there and goes, listen, Putin has agreed to the narrowest possible definition of ceasefire, while Ukraine has agreed to the broadest. And this should be a signal to the White House that Putin isn't very serious about a ceasefire. Because if you were serious, you would sit there and go, I'm so committed to this, I want to avoid any mistakes. So I'm going to operate on the broadest possible interpretation, right? It's sort of like saying, hey, if you go through a speed trap and you go 5 or 6 miles over the speed limit, you're like, whatever, you're kind of asking for it. But if you are committed to not violating the speed limit and not getting pulled over in that, podunk speed trap town, you go 2 or 3 miles under the speed limit to make sure that you don't deal with any issues, right? And so that's how Putin would behave if he was serious about not having this ceasefire fall apart and having it be seriously a move towards peace. But the fact that he isn't basically tells us that he's just playing games and stalling for time. And when we look over in the recent statements by the president, he admits he doesn't really have this situation under control, right? Somewhat under control is not the same thing as under control, right? Would you trust an Uber driver if you said, man, you're driving kind of erratically, buddy. Do you have this car under control? And he goes, I have it somewhat under control. That would be not confidence inspiring. In fact, you would take that to mean, in aspects, this is out. I don't have this under control. And so the president, he's talking to a sports media outlet that I've never heard of called Outkick, which is absolutely hilarious to me. And Trump is like, we've had very rational discussions with Putin. And he said, I don't think there's anybody in the world that's going to stop Putin except me, and I think I'm going to be able to stop him. And of course, by stop him, he acknowledges it's code for give him everything he wants, right? In fact, when asked in an interview, Trump's lead negotiator, Steve Witkoff, said 100% no. Witkoff said he didn't believe Moscow intended to absorb all of Ukraine, stating, quote, the Russians have what they want. They got back these 5 regions. They have Crimea. They got what they wanted, so what else do they want? And I think what he's saying is, I think he's referencing Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Crimea, the oblasts. And this, it's hilarious to me because Steve Witkoff himself is acknowledging that he has absolutely no idea what the Russians actually want because he thinks he knows what they want, these regions, right? And the fact that they have them and they're still fighting and they're not really interested in peace, he literally is like, what else do they want? What else do you want, Vladimir? And that's a sign, again, that Steve Witkoff, not to rehash yesterday's video, but just this is the level of sophistication that the Trump team is bringing to this, right? Steve Witkoff has been in an official government role. He has conducted diplomacy for approximately 90 days right now of his 68 years on this earth. And so the fact that he goes, well, Putin says he wants 5 regions and he has them, so then what's he fighting over? That's pretty bad. That's usually something that, a negotiator at almost even the most rudimentary level would understand, would take that to say, okay, well, clearly we don't have a complete understanding of this person, because if we did, then we'd be able to understand their actions, right? It's like, it's like a driver, right? If you see someone driving down the street and you think, well, they don't have a turn signal, so they're not going to turn. But you know that you don't have a complete picture of that driver's actions, particularly if they start to slow down as they approach a turn. So then you're going to say, I can't take an action because this driver could be slowing down because he sees me trying to pull out. He could be slowing down because he's going to try to turn, or he could be slowing down for an unrelated reason. Say there's a stoplight in front, or maybe he's just not paying attention. And so this is something that that you and I do every single day. And so it's preposterous that someone like Steve Witkoff can go, well, I don't understand. Why isn't he turning, right? Like it'd be comical if it wasn't lives on the line. And so I think even the Ukrainians at this point, in fact, are telling reporters they don't think these talks are going to go anywhere. Putin's just going to delay and get turned around. And basically Putin's only real objective is probably to get the American delegation convinced that the Ukrainians are the problem and not him, right? And you see they already kind of do that, right? Putin says, Witkoff sits there and goes, well, Putin has some non-negotiables. And frankly, he's already gotten some of them, right? The U.S. has said, well, there's no chance Ukraine's going to join NATO. Well, why did you give Putin one of his sticking points before negotiations have started? You've given up your position. It's completely inane and idiotic. And again, Putin has given up nothing. None of his ambitions have been curtailed at all. The only person who's had their desires curtailed has been Ukraine, which just is absurd, right? It's immorally unjust, sure. But one of the things that I think we always have to talk about on this channel, because it gets lost in the sauce, is that it's not just about what's right and just, right? If the U.S. had to correct every injustice on the globe, we'd run out of money and we'd run out of resources immediately. But what's important is that Putin cannot be allowed to succeed in annexing a portion of Ukraine and gaining himself a veto power over all NATO actions. Because remember, NATO has said Ukraine will be a member. Ukraine has said we're going to be a member, right? It's like, I consent, and Putin's like, I don't. And the problem is that in the meme, right? You know what meme I'm talking about? It's the Jesus meme. Here we go, right? And the point is that in this scenario, who is the boss? Who's the Lord of all? It's Jesus, right? That's the idea. That's the literal idea of like 2 adults can consent, but this third all-powerful being gets to decide, gets to reach their decision about what's going to happen. And because if you have the ability to veto actions, you have control, right? If you can tell someone what they can't do, in effect, you're telling them what they can, right? You can't turn left, you can't turn right, you can't go backwards. You've told them where they're going. And so this whole idea that Vladimir Putin wants to lord over NATO he's going to grant himself a veto power over all subsequent NATO entries and other NATO actions. So they have to decide if he can achieve his objectives of saying to NATO, no, you don't get to bring Ukraine in. And I want to point out, people are like, well, Ukraine was about to be a member. Ukraine was not about to be a member, right? The membership into NATO has been extremely slow. Let's see if we can find it here. If we can find the NATO enlargement by year, but it's actually like extremely, almost comically small. Here we go. So you can see that basically here's all the NATO members that arrived in 49, 52. And then, of course, Germany, right? You could see Spain entering in the 80s. And then literally almost 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw 3 former Soviet bloc countries join NATO. And then 5 years later, these Baltics, these are countries, by the way, on the border with Russia. So when Russia says, well, when they say, well, you were going to put you're going to put a NATO member on the border with Russia. You go, yeah, that happened in 2004. That occurred in 2004, right? And then after 2004, look at what membership has done. You have Albania, a state in the Balkans. You have Croatia, another Balkan state. You have Montenegro, a microstate. Literally, it is 5,000 square miles. It's nothing. It's a micro-principality, right? And so you see how, right? And then you have North Macedonia. So again, you're looking at these microstates, and then nothing. There is literally, so point this out to your friends, since 2009, there have been 4 states that have joined. And if you look from 2009 to Russia's invasion of Ukraine that spurred Finland and Sweden to join, 2 micronations joined, okay? 2 tiny, economically and politically isolated nations joined NATO. So when people say, oh, NATO is threatening Putin, with what? The fucking ascension of Montenegro, okay? NATO expansion had been checked. And so this idea that Putin was surrounded, that Putin was threatened by NATO is preposterous, right? And Putin knows this. And so the fact is that Putin, if he is able to achieve his victory, is going to deal permanent damage to NATO. And more importantly, he's going to establish a playbook by which authoritarian governments can use their willingness to engage in violence and the democratic world's unwillingness to engage in violence, their ultimate spinelessness, to extract concessions from them. Right? NATO will only now do things with Russian permission. So Russia can withhold permission and threaten NATO with any other action, meaning that Trump will be right. NATO will become worthless. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you guys, as always, for being members. Thanks to folks like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gars, Marning, Gina Quest, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Cars, L90, Petra Toro, and Jalen Gao. Thanks, of course, to all of our Lieutenant Tier members. Could not do it without you guys. See you over there. Cheers.